Imagine a man who could silence entire stadiums just by touching a football. A man so loved that fans tattooed his face onto their bodies. Priests compared him to God. Children named their sons after him. And an entire country of 40 million people placed their happiness, their identity, onto the shoulders of one single human being. His name was Diego Armando Maradona, and for a brief, extraordinary window of time, he was the most famous athlete on the planet. But here is the question nobody wants to ask. What does it cost a person to become a god? What happens to the boy underneath the legend? The boy who started with nothing, who clawed his way out of poverty, who gave everything he had to a sport, to a country, to a world that adored him. And what happens when that same world, the one that put him on a pedestal, decides he is no longer useful? This is not a story about football. This is the story of a boy who escaped hunger, became immortal, and then had to live with the consequences of both.
In the southern outskirts of Buenos Aires, there is a place called Villa Fiorito. Even today, it is not a comfortable place to live. In the 1960s, it was something much closer to survival. The streets were unpaved. Clean water was not guaranteed. The houses were built from whatever materials families could find: wood, metal sheets, concrete blocks, hope. Diego Maradona was born on October 30th, 1960. He was the fifth of 8 children. His father, Don Diego, worked in a factory. His mother, Dalma, whom Diego would call Doña Tota for the rest of his life, ran the household on almost nothing. There was no money for luxuries. There was often barely enough money for food. His cousins lived nearby, his aunts, his uncles. The family was large, loud, and deeply poor, but they were together. And then, when Diego was 3 years old, someone placed a football at his feet. He did not kick it away. He stopped. He looked at it. And something happened in that small child that no scientist has ever been able to fully explain. He could control the ball in ways that should not have been possible for someone his age. He could spin it, juggle it, pass it between his feet while barely looking down. Neighbors would stop in the street to watch. His cousins would call their parents outside. People would gather just to see this small, round-faced child from Villa Fiorito play with a football like it was an extension of his own body. He was not playing football. He was speaking a language only he understood. By the time Diego was 10 years old, he was performing at halftime shows for a youth team called Los Cebollitas, the Little Onions. He would juggle the ball for the crowd. Audiences packed the stands not for the main match, but to watch the child at halftime. At 10 years old. Scouts began to notice. Word spread through Buenos Aires football circles. There was a boy in Villa Fiorito who was doing things that grown men could not do. He was signed by Argentinos Juniors. He was put through their youth academy, and the coaches there quickly understood that what they were watching was not just talent, it was something that could not be taught. When Diego Maradona made his professional debut at the age of 15, he touched the ball for the first time and nutmegged an opponent, slipping the ball directly through a defender's legs, as casually as if he were stretching his arms in the morning. The crowd erupted. The stadium could feel it. Something was beginning. At 16, he was playing for Argentina's national team. At 17, he was the most talked about young footballer in South America. At 18, he was being described as the best player in the world. The boy from Villa Fiorito, the boy who grew up without money, without stability, without any of the resources that usually produce great athletes, was on the verge of something enormous. But with greatness comes something else. And Diego Maradona was about to find out exactly what that was. Argentina is a country that loves football the way other countries love religion. To understand Diego Maradona, you have to understand what Argentina was experiencing in the early 1980s. The country had just emerged from a brutal military dictatorship. Thousands of citizens had disappeared. The economy was collapsing. The Falklands War had ended in humiliation. The people were broken. And then there was Diego.
He was not just a footballer to them. He was proof. Proof that a boy with nothing could become everything. Proof that Argentina could produce something the rest of the world envied. Proof that they were not defeated. Every time Diego stepped onto a pitch, he carried the weight of 40 million stories. That is not a metaphor. That is a psychological reality that would slowly, methodically eat away at the human being underneath the jersey. Mexico City, June 1986. Argentina versus England. These two countries had gone to war 4 years earlier over a cluster of islands in the South Atlantic. The political wounds had not healed. The grief had not passed. And now, in the Estadio Azteca, 83,000 people watched as those two nations met on a football pitch. The match was tied at 0. The second half began. And then, Diego Maradona did two things that football had never seen before and has never seen since in the same game. In the 51st minute, he reached up with his left fist and punched the ball into the England goal. The referee did not see it. The goal was given. Maradona ran to his teammates, and when journalists asked him afterwards how the goal went in, he smiled and said it was scored a little with the head of Maradona and a little with the hand of God. The hand of God, a moment of audacity, of cunning, of controversy that the world still argues about today. But 4 minutes later, Diego Maradona did something that required no controversy. He received the ball just inside his own half. He turned, and then he ran. He beat one player, then another, then another. He changed direction, he accelerated, he left defenders sprawled on the grass behind him. He cut inside, he pushed the ball forward, and then he slid it past the goalkeeper and into the net. He had dribbled past 6 players in 11 seconds and scored one of the greatest goals in the history of sport. The commentators screamed, "Goal, goal, goal, Maradona, genius, genius, genius." Argentina won the World Cup, and Diego Maradona became immortal. 2 years before the World Cup, Diego had moved to Italy, to a city called Naples. Naples in 1984 was a city that understood suffering. It was one of the poorest cities in Italy. People in the wealthy north of the country looked down on the south. Naples was considered less than, forgotten, struggling. And then Diego Maradona arrived. He did not just bring football, he brought identity. He brought pride. He told this forgotten city in the south that it could compete with anyone. And then he proved it on the pitch, week after week, season after season. Under Maradona, Napoli won their first ever Serie A title, then their second. They reached European finals. They defeated teams with 10 times their budget. The city did not celebrate him. They worshipped him. Murals of his face appeared on the walls of buildings. Shrines were built in his honor. Fans wrote him letters. They brought him gifts. Priests gave sermons about what he meant to the city. When he was sick, people prayed for his health in the streets. Diego Maradona was no longer a footballer in Naples. He was a saint. But no human being can carry the weight of sainthood. Not for long. Fame is not just photographers and applause. It is also loneliness. It is not being able to walk to a restaurant without being surrounded. It is not knowing which of your friends like you and which of them like what you represent. It is having people make decisions for you about your schedule, your image, your public statements, until you stop being sure who you actually are underneath all of it. Diego Maradona had handlers, hangers-on, and yes-men surrounding him everywhere he went. People who wanted a piece of the legend. People who offered him things, parties, substances, escapes, not because they cared about him, but because they wanted access to his world. The pressure had been building for years. The expectation, the obsession, the responsibility of being everything to everyone. And somewhere in that pressure, Diego Maradona found cocaine. It began as these things always do, quietly, a way to unwind, a way to switch off the noise, a way to feel like a person and not a monument. But addiction does not stay quiet. And Diego, the boy from Villa Fiorito who had survived on instinct and will, was no match for a force he had never been prepared for. The warning signs appeared. The fitness dropped. The performances became inconsistent. People around him saw what was happening, and too few of them said anything. The world watched, and Diego fell. In 1991, Diego Maradona tested positive for cocaine. He received a 15-month ban from football. The golden years at Napoli were over. He left the city in disgrace. His relationship with the club, with the fans, with Italy itself collapsed. He returned to Argentina. He tried to rebuild. Moments of the old brilliance came back. He led Argentina to another World Cup final in 1990, lost narrowly to Germany. He played in 1994, and then 5 matches in, tested positive again for stimulants. He was expelled from the tournament. The image of Maradona being led off the pitch by a drug tester, screaming into the camera, his eyes wild, his face contorted, became one of the most iconic and heartbreaking images in sporting history. He was 33 years old. His career, for all meaningful purposes, was over. What followed was a decade of pain. His weight fluctuated violently, his health deteriorated. He was hospitalized multiple times for heart problems, for respiratory failure, for the accumulated damage of years of addiction and excess. There were public breakdowns, there were scandals, there were moments where the people who loved him wondered if he would survive the week. The man who had once been the most physically gifted footballer on the planet could barely walk across a room without discomfort. And all the while, the world, the same world that had placed everything on his shoulders, watched and judged and talked.
But this is the part of the story that the headlines rarely tell. Diego Maradona, even in his worst years, never stopped being human. He wept openly when he spoke about his mother. He was devoted to his children in the way that only someone who grew up with almost nothing can be. He wanted to give them everything he never had. He was generous to the people of Villa Fiorito, returning home long after he was world famous, spending time with the children there, remembering where he came from. He struggled, publicly, painfully, in ways that made people uncomfortable. But in his later years, he also found moments of redemption. He managed football clubs in Venezuela, in Mexico, in Argentina's lower leagues. He coached the Argentine national team from 2008 to 2010 and took them to the World Cup, despite most experts saying it could not be done. There were flashes of the old Diego, the warmth, the charisma, the joy when a player scored, the way he could light up a room just by entering it. He had been through things that would have broken most people entirely, and yet he kept standing up. Imperfect, complicated, deeply flawed, human. On the 25th of November, 2020, Diego Armando Maradona died at his home in Buenos Aires. He was 60 years old. He had suffered a cardiac arrest. Argentina stopped. The president declared 3 days of national mourning. The streets filled with people, not the organized grief of a state funeral, but something raw and less controlled. People who had never met him, who had only watched him from the stands or through television screens, stood together and wept. In Naples, fans gathered outside the stadium and lit candles. In Mexico City, supporters left flowers at the Estadio Azteca. In cities across South America, across Europe, across the world, people who had grown up watching him sat quietly and thought about what he had meant to them. Because Diego Maradona had meant something different to almost everyone. To the poor, he was proof that where you start does not determine where you finish. To Argentina, he was the purest expression of national identity and pride. To football fans, he was the greatest to ever play the game. To Naples, he was a saint who gave a forgotten city its dignity back. And to the rest of us, the ones watching from a distance, he was something rarer than all of that. He was honest. He did not pretend to be perfect. He did not hide his failures behind a carefully managed public image. He was brilliant and broken, generous and selfish, magnificent and messy, all at once. He was everything a human being can be, at the absolute extremes of both sides. And in a world that asks its icons to be flawless, Diego Maradona had the courage, or perhaps just the inability, to be fully, completely himself. The boy from Villa Fiorito never stopped being that boy, even when the whole world was watching. That is why, more than anything, we still talk about him. Not because he was the best, but because he was real. If this story moved you,
If any part of Diego Maradona's journey made you feel something, then I want to know. Drop a comment below. Tell me, was Diego Maradona football's greatest tragedy, its greatest gift, or both? Because stories like his deserve to be talked about. They deserve to be remembered. Not the highlight reels, not the trophies, but the full human story. The cost of greatness, the price of worship, and what gets left behind. If you want more documentaries like this one, stories about the greatest footballers, the most iconic moments, the victories and the collapses that shaped this sport, then subscribe to MindForge right now. Every week, we go deeper than the headlines. Hit the like button if this hit you differently than you expected. And share this with someone who thinks they already know everything about Diego Maradona. Because I promise you, nobody knows the full story until they feel it.